Hello beautiful souls, welcome back to Ladybug Farm. Today we are planting Determinate tomatoes, and since we chose not to do our Tips to Growing Terrific Tomatoes workshop this spring, I thought I could offer you a few tips for planting your garden. First, we'll start with some interesting facts about tomatoes. Did you know that the very first tomatoes were cultivated by the Mayans and Mesoamericans? They cultivated them, they cooked with them, and you can still find some wild varieties of these tomatoes in Peru, in Ecuador, and in northern Chile. And even in the 18th century, let's fast forward a long time here, the 18th century, the early 19th century, here in Northern America, they weren't that popular. People had a really bad reputation with tomatoes. They thought they were poisonous, which could possibly be because the actual leaves of tomatoes, those are poisonous. The actual smell of tomatoes is very unique, and potato plants themselves produce a fruit that looks very similar to a tomato, but that is poisonous. So very interesting dynamics here. Fast forward that again to now, 2020, seems like every American craves that taste of a sun-ripened summer tomato. So let's figure out how to get them in your garden so that you can have that taste, because you just can't find that at the grocery store. That amazing, amazing taste that you can get from a container on your back porch or a garden of any size in your backyard. Tomatoes are started by seed indoors. You want to start them a good 6 to 10 weeks prior to your last expected frost. So depending on where you are, that's going to be a different time. These seedlings are so small for us this year. They are only 6 weeks old. Last year we started 10 to 12 weeks prior, and we gave them so much TLC. We upplanted them, we gave them fish emulsion and kelp fertilizer, and they were great, ginormous, ready to go out into the garden. But we have hardened them off for the past week. You need to let your seedlings acclimate from that constant, stable indoor environment to be able to come out here and not be totally shocked once they get their first wind, or once they get their first rain, or once they get the first direct sunlight. So it takes about a week to harden that off. If you're buying tomatoes from the nursery or from a store, just make sure to ask if these tomatoes have been hardened off or not. Your seedlings are going to need space in their root zone to develop. You can see I already have some roots out of this tiny little tomato. There's already roots coming down searching for nutrients. Tomato roots can grow up to 4 feet deep, which is why I don't recommend, if you're doing a raised bed, putting a weed barrier down, because that really is going to inhibit the growth of your roots from developing, and hence bringing forth more nutrients to your plants and to the fruit that you'll be eating. If you don't have any sort of season extension to protect these little babies, you are going to need to wait until your last expected frost. For us here, we just hit our last expected frost on April 15th, which means with no extra season protection, anything going on these seedlings, when I put them straight out into the garden, I prefer to wait until April 20th. I check out the extended forecast for the week ahead, and I want to make sure my nights are clear. 50s, above 50s are going to be ideal, and that's going to let me know you're good to go. If you're looking like there's any nights that are still in your 30s, whoa, in your low 40s, whoa, hold off if you can. It's going to give a little bit of damage to your tomatoes, or it could make them a little weaker and more prone to disease later on in life. So it's better to hold off and wait until you look clear to go and plant your tomatoes. For us, if you don't get your tomatoes in right at April 20th, that's okay. You have until July 15th to plant your tomatoes, so you have plenty of time. There are 2 growth habits to look at when you are planting your tomatoes, and you need to know which growth habit you are planting so that you know how are you going to set these tomatoes up into your garden? Today we are talking about determinate tomatoes. There are also indeterminate tomatoes. Those are a whole nother beast. We're not going to talk about those really today. Today I am planting some determinate Roma tomatoes. These are also called a bush tomato. They're compact. They are not going to grow above 5 feet, sometimes not even above 4 feet, which means these tomato cages are going to actually work for your determinate tomatoes. Do not try tomato cages with your indeterminate tomatoes because they will grow right over the top of that and you'll quickly be looking for another solution. So make sure your tomato cages are large. They do come in different sizes. Make sure you have a nice large tomato cage for your determinate tomatoes. Your determinate tomatoes are going to have a massive fruit set all within a very short time period, which makes these tomatoes ideal for canning because all of a sudden you have an abundance of tomatoes. Romas especially, they have a lot of meat to them, not much seeds. These are my favorite, most recommended tomatoes if you want to put up pasta sauce or pizza sauce. Definitely recommend the Roma tomatoes. You do not prune or sucker these tomatoes. Really important because anytime you're going through and removing those leaves, removing those flowers, you are reducing your yield for your tomatoes because the onset of fruit is all at once. It's not like your indeterminates, which are going to produce here and here and here and there and there all the way until frost. And since this plant yields all of its tomato harvest all at once, it's not going to go until frost. About midsummer, I rip all these plants out and I put in a second harvest of crops, whether it's crops or whether it's cover crops like your buckwheat. For spacing, square foot gardening is going to recommend 1 plant per square foot. But I have found that if I do 1 plant per square foot and fill my entire garden bed with that many tomatoes, the plants do not do well. They yield disease and they are just too crowded. So determinate tomatoes, I would recommend spacing them 2 feet apart, 3 feet between your rows. You want to plant your seedlings in the late afternoon so that way they have the nighttime to adjust before they have the intensity of the summer sun the following day. If you can follow your planting with a partly cloudy day and plan that way, that's even better to help your seedling off. Here I have my seedlings in some peat pots, and you can plant directly into your garden with those peat pots. I just recommend pulling a little bit of the tops away, putting a crack in the bottom first, and that way it allows the roots not to become so root bound. Another recommendation people have is to put a handful of some bone meal into your hole for transplanting, and that primarily is to reduce blossom end rot. And for me, I found that blossom end rot is really more caused by inconsistent watering rather than your soil deficiency. So just make sure you're evenly watering your plants. Also, if you have a plant like this, it's a little bit leggy here. With tomatoes, you can plant them deep. Leggy means that it's nice, tall, and thin. It's not short and stocky. I can plant this tomato all the way up here, and this entire stem right here will turn into roots and give this plant a stronger base towards growth and nutrients later in life.
I'm trying to get this rock out. Help.
Yes, ma'am. No, it's just such a nice day out that the bees are out foraging. And
I don't see that much
because your hive's a little bit smaller. Go from the front side, go from the south side, and you will see more worker bees. As I mentioned earlier, because this is a determinate tomato, you can surround it in a tomato cage, just for a little extra support later in life as it grows nice and strong. Okay, and on to the next. As I reach down into my hole, the soil is still pretty damp down here. You can see we have nice, healthy soil. It's not dry, it's still damp. If it was dry, I would add some water and submerge that plant right into the water, but it is still damp with the soil down here, and I will water it right after we transplant. And speaking of watering, the best time after this to water your plants will be just after the heat of the day, depending on the season, but it's gonna be afternoon, early evening. When watering, you do not want to wet your foliage. That's why we put drip in last year, and it is such a blessing. Yes, it is going to rain, and there is going to be soil splashed up onto your plants, but you don't want to hand water yourself and add insult to injury. If your tomato leaves are wet and there is a potato field nearby that has late blight, that blows over to your tomatoes, they are doomed. So do what you can. Try not to get those leaves wet. And I know I said no suckering, no pruning, but in a case like this where I do not have a living mulch down, I do not have a weed cloth down, some people will sucker off those bottoms, like right there, and they'll take that bottom leaf out up to the first 10 to 12 inches. They'll do that just to prevent any rain splashing up onto the leaves, to prevent any kind of foliar disease. But again, that is completely optional and up to you. Our tomatoes are in the ground. Our seedlings have been watered. And coming back to the watering stance, it seems like everyone has a different opinion on how to water your tomatoes. Some people say, let them suffer a little bit. Some people believe in deep watering once a week. Other people believe in consistent, daily, even watering. So I just recommend try it, see what works for you, and over time, you are going to find what works for you. I mentioned we only have 6 Determinate Roma tomatoes planted in this garden bed, and that's because this garden bed has a lot of companions in it. We have garlic, we have onions, we have some multiplier onions. Seeds in the ground are nasturtiums and beets, and all of those are companions to your tomatoes. You also have parsley, asparagus, chives, carrots. Those are all companions to your tomatoes that will improve the growth and flavor, including marigolds. There's a certain species, a certain variety of marigold which will deter the bad nematodes in your soil, and nematodes can really be a problem for your tomatoes. So marigolds are another very good companion to have with your tomatoes. I have never had tomatoes growing in this garden bed here, and that's a good thing. You do not want to plant your tomatoes in any soil, whether it's a garden bed, whether it's in the ground, or whether it's a pot. You do not want to plant your tomatoes in any place where you had tomatoes last year or the year prior. Tomatoes have some diseases which will overwinter in the soil, and if your tomato plant had that disease last year, now it's going to have it again this year. So make sure you're rotating your crop and keep your tomatoes away from potatoes, kohlrabi, and cabbage. Those are some antagonists that the tomatoes just do not like to grow next to. So thanks for joining us today, everybody. I hope this helped a wee bit with planting determinate tomatoes in your garden. And I hope that in a few months you have some delicious sauce tomatoes to enjoy. Have a beautiful day, everybody.